He threw her suitcase onto the marble floor at 2:13 in the morning, in front of every man who feared his name. Dante Vercelli, Chicago's most dangerous crime boss, stood in the center of his own estate and pointed at the door like she was staff he'd caught stealing silverware. 6 years of marriage. 6 years of her sitting quietly at the edge of his world. And now he was ending it, in front of 12 armed men, his jaw tight, his eyes flat, because $3 million had vanished from his accounts, and his most trusted captain was dead on a warehouse floor. He looked at Elara Vale and said, "Get out of my house." She didn't cry, didn't beg. She reached up, slid her wedding ring off her finger, and set it down beside his gun on the table. "You're going to regret believing the wrong person," she said. Then she walked out into the storm. If you've ever been blamed for something you spent years trying to prevent, hit that subscribe button right now and don't go anywhere. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has already traveled. Like this video if you want to know what Dante found inside his office after she left, because what he discovered is going to change everything you think you know about silence. Part 1. The rain had been falling since midnight, and by the time Elara's black sedan reached the iron gates of the Bella Vita estate, it had turned the gravel driveway into a shallow river. She sat in the back without speaking. Her driver, a retired man named Sal, who had worked for the household for 4 years, and who had never once asked her a single personal question, kept his eyes forward and said nothing. That was why she kept him. She already knew what was waiting inside. The light in Dante's study had been on since 10 o'clock. She could see it from the gate. His car was in the drive. Along with 3 others, she recognized Petrov's SUV, Carmine's old Escalade, and a black Lincoln that belonged to Victor Rusk, Dante's consigliere, the man who had been whispering in Dante's ear since before Elara had ever set foot in this city. Stone in her chest, the one she'd been carrying for 6 years, settled heavier. She told Sal to take the night off. She got out of the car herself, pulled her coat closed against the rain, and walked to the front door. She could hear Dante's voice before she reached the top step. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing people always misunderstood about Dante Vercelli. He didn't shout when he was at his most dangerous. He got quiet, clipped, like every word cost him something, and he was making sure whoever received it paid full price. She pushed open the door, 12 men in his entry hall. That was her first count, running automatically as it always did positions, exits, who was armed where. Petrov near the fireplace, arms crossed, not meeting her eyes. Carmine by the staircase, jaw tight. Victor Rusk at Dante's right shoulder, which is where Victor Rusk always stood when he wanted Dante to feel supported and couldn't actually be seen giving the instruction. Dante was standing in the center of the hall, her suitcase at his feet. She didn't know how long it had been sitting there. Long enough that he'd had someone pack it, which meant this had been deliberate, which meant he had made the decision. Before she had even come home tonight, he hadn't called her, hadn't sent a message. He had made the decision, packed her things, and summoned his men to witness it. That was Dante. Theater was inseparable from power in his world. You didn't just execute a decision. You performed it. She met his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked furious. And underneath both of those things, underneath the flatness he'd cultivated, so carefully she could see something else. Something she hadn't expected. He looked betrayed. Victor found the accounts, Dante said. It wasn't a question. Elara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the suitcase on the floor. She looked at the 12 men watching her. She looked at Victor Rusk, who was watching her, with the particular expression of a man who has just won something and is being careful not to look like he knows it. Which accounts, she said. Don't. The word came out of Dante like a crack in ice, sudden and final. Don't insult me right now. $3 million. Bracco dead on the floor of the East Side warehouse. And your signature on a wire transfer that moved funds the night before every one of my operations in the last 4 months went sideways. My signature. Stop talking like that. I'm asking you a specific question, Dante. Victor has documentation. She looked at Victor. Victor met her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He had a folder in his hands, actual paper, which she noted because Victor was not a paper man by nature. He preferred digital files because digital files could be edited. Paper felt more permanent to a jury. Bank routing records, Victor said. His voice was smooth and careful, the voice of a man who understood that delivering bad news required the same technique as delivering good news slowly, with apparent reluctance. Transfer logs, and a communication trail that traces back to a contact in the Calderon family. Calderon Syndicate, Chicago's second power, operating out of the South Side, a family that had been trying to crack Dante's operation for going on a decade. Elara kept her face still. "You believe this," she said to Dante. "Not Victor. Dante." Dante's jaw moved. "I believe what I can see. Then you should look more carefully." "Elara, I have been in this house for 6 years." Her voice didn't rise. She had learned that from him, actually, the value of staying low when everything in you wanted to climb. "I have sat in rooms where your men planned operations I had no legal right to know about. I have watched you make decisions that put people in the ground. I have never once, not once, moved against you. Counts are not what Victor told you they are." The room was very quiet. Dante looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The man she had married was not stupid. Whatever else he was sharp, and he was careful, and he was capable of looking at contradictions and sitting with the discomfort of them rather than forcing an explanation that didn't fit. It was one of the things that had made him dangerous, and one of the things that had, at various points across 6 years, made her respect him more than she wanted to. But tonight, there was something else working in him. Something that didn't care about the contradictions. Something that needed a clean story and an exit and a person to blame. She recognized it because she had been watching for it for 6 years. "Whatever you were hiding," Dante said finally, his voice going cold in the particular way that meant the decision was already made. "You're done hiding it under my roof." She held his eyes for 3 seconds. Then she reached up and took off her ring. She set it on the entry table, next to his gun, which he always left there. When he came home, old habit. Muscle memory, like hanging up a coat. "You're going to regret believing the wrong person," she said. Picked up her suitcase, and she walked out into the storm. Sal was still parked at the end of the drive, despite what she'd told him. He didn't say anything when she opened the door and got in. He just pulled out of the gate and drove, and she sat in the back and watched the rain move across the window in sheets, and she let herself have exactly 45 seconds of feeling whatever it was that lived below the stone in her chest. Then she put it away. She had work to do. The phone she used for this one of 3 she carried that no one in Dante's organization knew existed showed 2 messages. She read both of them. She replied to one. Then she looked out the window at the wet city, moving past, and allowed herself one thought about Dante Vercelli. Before she put him in the compartment where she kept things she couldn't afford to feel, he had just done exactly what she needed him to do. Didn't make it hurt less, but it made it necessary. The house in Pilsen had once belonged to her mother's cousin, a woman named Rosaria, who had died of a stroke 7 years ago, and left the property in a state of arranged neglect. Utilities paid on a timer account, taxes current, exterior maintained just enough to avoid city notice. From the street, it looked abandoned. The kind of house a neighborhood forgets about. Elara had been using it for 4 years. She arrived at 3:30 in the morning. The back door recognized her thumbprint. Inside, the basement level, which did not appear on any building record, for this address was lit and warm and occupied. 3 women looked up when she came down the stairs. Margot, who had spent 11 years as an intelligence analyst before a classified operation went wrong and left her unemployable in the government sector, was seated at the main console, headphones around her neck. She had the particular quality of stillness that came from years of listening to things other couldn't hear. Danny, who was 26 and had grown up 4 blocks from this house, and who had a gift for financial architecture that Elara had never seen in anyone who actually had a finance degree, was running numbers on a secondary screen, her pen moving in the margin of a printed ledger. The third woman, older than the other 2, somewhere in her late 50s, with the careful posture of someone who had once moved through rooms where being noticed was dangerous, was simply called Pris. Elara had never used her real name. She wasn't sure Margot and Danny knew it. Pris handled the things that couldn't be handled from behind a screen. "He did it," Margot said. "Yes. How'd he look?" Elara set her bag down, like someone who needed it to be me. Margot made a small sound that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite satisfaction. turned back to her screen. Victor moved fast. Feeds show the folder left his office at 8 p.m., which means he had it ready and was waiting for the right moment. Bracco, Elara said. That's my read. Victor needed something concrete to attach to you. Bracco's death gave him a story. Bracco was killed because he was about to talk, Danny said without looking up from her ledger. I've been running the payment chain on the East Side operation. Victor's been pulling from that account for 8 months. Small enough draws to stay under the threshold. But there's a pattern. She tapped her pen against the page. Every draw happens 48 hours before an operation gets compromised. The room was quiet for a moment. Elara sat down. She peeled off her wet coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, just a moment. He's going to look at the surveillance files, she said. Tonight? Margot asked. He won't be able to sleep. He'll go back to the office and he'll look at everything. She dropped her hands. Make sure the EV signature is findable, not obvious. He needs to find it himself. Margot raised an eyebrow. You sure about the timing? He needs to think he discovered it. If it's handed to him, he won't trust it. Danny finally looked up. She studied Elara for a moment with the direct assessment of someone who didn't waste social energy on things she didn't mean. You knew he was going to throw you out. It wasn't a question. I thought it was possible, Elara said. That's not the same as knowing. No, Elara agreed. It's not. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and removed a slim drive. She set it on the table between them. Victor's not the top. There is someone above him. I've had fragments for 2 years routing patterns. A name that surfaces in financial records and disappears, again, an organizational structure that Victor doesn't have the reach or the capital to have built on his own. She looked at the drive. Everything I've collected is on there. We have a window now. Dante is off balance, and Victor thinks he's won. That gives us maybe 72 hours before Victor realizes the accounts don't tell the story he thinks they tell and starts looking for what else is in the system. Pris, who had not spoken until now, said quietly, And Dante? Elara looked at her. He's going to come looking for you, Pris said. Not tonight. Tonight he's angry. But by tomorrow or the day after he's going to start pulling that thread. And when he does, he'll find exactly what he's supposed to find, Elara said. In the sequence he's supposed to find it. Pris was quiet for a moment. You're using him. I'm giving him the truth. Elara's voice was steady. He just has to find it himself, in the right order, or he won't believe it. And if he reaches you before he's ready to hear it. Elara thought about Dante's face when she walked out. Thing underneath the flatness. The thing that had looked like betrayal, but was, actually, she understood this now. Looking back at it from 45 minutes of distance, something closer to grief. She had studied Dante Vercelli for 6 years. She knew the difference. He'll reach me, she said. I'm counting on it. Dante did not sleep. He sat in his study for 20 minutes after the men had cleared out. Victor last to leave, lingering at the door with the careful solicitude of a man who understood that comfort, offered at the right moment, was its own form of control. Get some rest, Victor had said. We'll deal with the rest in the morning. Dante had said nothing, just waited until the door closed. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the empty space on the entry table where her ring had been. Couldn't see it from here, but he knew exactly where it was, and his eyes kept moving to the wall beyond the study door as if he could see through it. She hadn't cried. He had expected, had prepared for something. Anger, maybe. Denial, some kind of negotiation. 6 years of knowing Elara Vale, and he still didn't have a complete map of her, which was something he should have taken as information about her a long time ago. Quiet people were not simple people. He knew this, had known it, and had still, somewhere in the machinery of the last 4 hours, managed to forget it. She'd taken off her ring like she'd been waiting to. Couldn't stop thinking about that. He got up at 4 in the morning and went to the security office on the east wing of the house. The room where the surveillance systems fed into archival storage. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He told himself he was looking for confirmation, something that would settle the question the way Victor's folder hadn't quite managed to settle it, despite his best efforts. He started pulling files. An hour in, he found the first one by accident surveillance risk record from 11 months ago, date stamped, filed under an innocuous alphanumeric code that shouldn't have been in this system at all. He almost scrolled past it. Something made him stop. He opened it. It was a communication intercept. Clean, formatted, professional, the kind of documentation that intelligence people produced, not the rough field notes his own men used. It contained a warning, specific details about a planned ambush on Dante's convoy during a product transfer in the warehouse district. The date matched a night 11 months ago, when the transfer had been rerouted. At the last minute, Dante had been told there was a logistics problem, a miscommunication about the loading schedule. The reroute had meant his convoy never passed through the ambush site. At the bottom of the intercept, a signature, EV. Dante stared at it. He pulled another file and another. The further he went, the steadier his hands got, not because he was calming down, but because the thing he was feeling had moved past anger into something colder and more structural. A man in his position learned to work in that state, to think in it. Over the next 3 hours, he found 41 files, 41 documented instances across 6 years, warned ambushes, rerouted money not stolen, but moved, cleanly and temporarily, in patterns that consistently preceded either a rival family's attempt to seize the funds or a law enforcement sweep that would have frozen the accounts. Fake identities for witnesses who had since disappeared safely. Assassination attempts that had failed for reasons his own security team had never been able to fully explain. Every file, same signature, EV. By 7 in the morning, Dante was sitting very still in his chair with 41 printed pages in a stack in front of him, and the only thing moving was his jaw, working silently, like he was chewing on something he couldn't quite break down. Someone had been protecting his empire for 6 years, from inside, and she had walked out the door 6 hours ago because he had pointed at it and told her to leave. He picked up his phone, then he put it down. Then he picked it up again and called a number that wasn't in his contacts list, but that he had memorized years ago the way he had memorized all the numbers he couldn't afford to lose. It rang 4 times before anyone answered. "Richie," said the voice on the other end flat. "Professional, early morning. I need a location," Dante said. "Someone who doesn't want to be found." Pause. "This is your wife we're talking about." "Yes." Another pause, longer. Ricci was not a man who wasted words, which was why Dante trusted him with things he couldn't put through his regular channels. "Threw her out at 2 in the morning. I'm aware. And now you want to find her. I'm aware of that too." Ricci was quiet for a moment, and Dante could hear faintly the sound of a city waking up behind him, traffic and distance. "You know," Ricci said finally, "most men in your position would have found out who she was before they married her. Ricci, I'll make some calls." A pause. "But Dante, if she didn't want to be found, you're not going to find her through me. You're going to find her because she decides to let you." The line went quiet. Dante set the phone down. He looked at the 41 pages. He thought about her ring sitting on the entry table beside his gun. He thought about the way she had looked at him before she walked out, not angry, not frightened, not even particularly sad, just steady. Like a woman who had already calculated the next 17 moves and was watching him make the one she'd been waiting for. He had believed the wrong person, and somewhere in this city, Elara Valle was already 3 steps ahead of whatever came next. He just didn't know yet that she had built those steps for him. Ricci called back at 9:47. Dante was on his second cup of coffee, standing at the window of his study, watching the rain from the night before dry off the driveway in slow patches. He hadn't eaten, hadn't changed clothes. The 41 pages were still on his desk, corners perfectly aligned, because he'd straightened them 3 times without thinking about it, the kind of compulsive small order a man imposes on his immediate environment when everything outside it is coming apart. He picked up on the first ring. "She's not at any of the usual places," Ricci said. "Not the apartment on Wabash, not the lake house, not the Meridian Hotel. She's not using any card connected to your accounts. She has her own accounts. I know, those are cleaned too, no activity since last Tuesday." A pause. "She's off the grid, Dante. Deliberately. She planned this. Looks that way." Dante was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of his groundsmen was raking wet leaves off the front walk, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who'd been doing the same task for 20 years. Dante watched him without seeing him. "What about her phone?" he said. The registered one hasn't pinged a tower since 11 p.m. last night. Richie's voice was careful in the way that meant he was about to say something Dante wasn't going to like. There may be other phones. You think she's been running separate communications? I think if half of what you found in those surveillance files is accurate, then yes, she's been running an operations sophisticated enough to require communications. You did another pause. Shorter, which means you didn't know your wife as well as you thought you did. I'm aware, Richie. I'm just establishing the scope of the problem. Dante ended the call. He set the phone face down on the desk and stood very still for a moment, breathing slowly through his nose. There was a version of himself, the version that had built this organization from a mid-level street operation into the dominant power in Chicago's underground economy over 15 years, that knew exactly what to do with a problem of this scope. You mapped it. You identified every moving part. You didn't make a second move until you understood the first one completely. He was having difficulty accessing that version of himself this morning. Picked up the 41 pages and read the first one again from the top. Victor arrived at the estate at 10:15, unannounced, which was not unusual. In the years he had served as Dante's consigliere, Victor Rusk had made a practice of treating the Bellavita estate like an extension of his own office, arriving when he judged his presence necessary, staying as long as the situation required, departing when he was satisfied that the day's business had been properly oriented. It was a habit that Dante had permitted because Victor was, in the calculus of organizational loyalty, as close to indispensable as anyone in the operation. That assessment was now under review. Dante heard him come in, heard the particular cadence of his footsteps in the hall, confident and unhurried, the walk of a man who had never been asked to wait. He let Victor reach the study door and knock before he said anything. "Come in." Victor entered, assessed the room in the practiced way of a man whose survival instincts were highly developed, and settled into the chair across from Dante's desk without being invited. He was wearing a good suit, rested, groomed. He looked like a man who had slept well. "You look terrible," Victor said. "I didn't sleep." "Understandable." Victor's voice carried the warmth of genuine sympathy, which was one of the things that made him effective, and one of the things that Dante could see now, in the particular clarity that came from a sleepless night, should have made him more suspicious a long time ago. The situation with Elara, it's not an easy thing. Whatever she did, what exactly did she do, Victor? Small pause, almost imperceptible. "We've been over the documentations. Tell me again." Dante's voice was flat. "Accounts. Walk me through the specific transfers." Victor looked at him steadily. Question unsettled him. He didn't show it. The primary transfer moved $2.8 million from the operations reserve on the 14th. Secondary movement of roughly $200,000 from the contingency fund 3 days later. Both routed through shell accounts that trace back to a financial intermediary the Calderon family has used before. Trace back how far? 2 hops. Third-party routing. So not direct. Direct enough. Dante picked up one of the 41 pages and turned it face up on the desk, but didn't push it toward Victor. He watched Victor's eyes move to it, and then returned to Dante's face with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided not to react to something. "I found some files last night," Dante said. "What kind of files?" "Surveillance records. Going back 6 years. He watched Victor. "Someone inside this organization has been running a parallel intelligence operation, documenting threats, rerouting assets before they could be seized, flagging compromised personnel." He paused, consistently and correctly, across 6 years. Victor was very still. "The accounts Elara moved," Dante said. "The 3 million. I want you to tell me specifically what operation those funds were supporting when they were moved." "Beat. The East Side consolidation," Victor said. "The funds were earmarked for. The East Side consolidation was postponed 6 weeks ago." Dante's voice didn't change. "By you. You told me there was a logistics issue with the contact chain. We held the funds in reserve." He set the page down. "So what were those funds actually doing in the account they were moved from?" The room was very quiet. Victor's expression didn't break. It was too good for that. But something shifted at the edges of it, something Dante would have missed if he hadn't been watching for it. Slight tightening around the eyes. A fraction of a second's delay before the next breath. I'd have to pull the specific records, Victor said. Take your time, Dante. Victor's voice shifted warmer, more concerned, leaning into something that resembled genuine worry. I understand you're looking for another explanation. Last night was hard. Elara has been part of your life for 6 years, and finding out she's been working against. I didn't say she was working against me. Silence. Dante leaned back in his chair. I said someone has been running a parallel operation. I didn't assign it to anyone. You did that. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet." Dante's voice was almost pleasant. "I'm asking you to pull the specific records on those accounts and bring them to me this afternoon. All of them. Unedited." A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Of course," Victor said. He left 20 minutes later. Dante listened to his footsteps recede down the hall slightly faster than they'd arrived. Confidence in them slightly more worked at, and then he sat alone in his study and thought about the fact that Victor had not asked a single question about the surveillance files. A man who had nothing to hide would have asked what was in them. Victor had not asked because he already knew. By noon, Dante had made 3 calls he didn't route through any of his regular channels, and had dispatched Carmine, one of the 2 men in his organization. He currently trusted without qualification to pull physical records from a secondary storage location that Victor didn't know existed. Carmine was back by 2 o'clock. He dropped a bound folder on Dante's desk and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has just read something that made him feel sick and is holding it together on professionalism alone. "Tell me," Dante said. "The East Side account." Carmine's voice was level. Victor has been running draws against it for 8 months. Small, always under the threshold, but consistent, and always 48 to 72 hours before one of our operations in that zone got hit. Dante said nothing. "Bracco knew," Carmine said. "That's my read. Bracco started keeping his own records about 4 months ago. I found a secondary set of notes tucked into the back of the physical ledger. He was building a case." A pause. "He was going to bring it to you. And instead he ended up on the warehouse floor." "Yes." Dante stood up. He walked to the window. The driveway was fully dry now, the groundsman long gone, everything looking the way it always looked, maintained and quiet and controlled, the surface of a world that bore no visible trace of what ran underneath it. "Victor didn't act alone," Dante said. "No. The capital flow is too large. He's been funneling to an intermediary, and the intermediary connects to..." Carmine paused, turned a page in the folder. "There's a name that comes up. Not often. Buried in the routing chain's 3rd and 4th hop. Marcellus Kane." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Dante turned from the window. Marcellus Kane was not a name you heard often, because Marcellus Kane had spent 40 years ensuring that his name was not heard. He existed in the organizational history of Chicago's underworld, the way a structural beam existed in a building. Essential, invisible, noticed only when something went wrong. He had been a power broker before Dante's time, before Dante's predecessor's time, a man who built networks the way other men, built houses foundation first, then walls, then roof. Then he walked away and let someone else live in it while he collected rent from a distance. Dante had met him once, 7 years ago, at a function in the Gold Coast. They had spoken for perhaps 8 minutes. Kane had been warm and specific and interested in precisely the right things, and Dante had come away from the conversation with the impression of a man who was far more present in the world than he appeared to be. He had not thought about Marcellus Kane since. "How long," Dante said, "has Kane been connected to this operation?" "Best I can read the records from the beginning." Carmine's voice was careful. "Dante, the routing patterns in the early accounts, the ones from before you took over full control of the organization, they trace back to structures Kane built. Which means he built the organization. He built the infrastructure the organization runs on." A pause. "And he's been sitting on the outside of it, collecting information ever since." Dante pressed one hand flat against the desk. He thought about the last 15 years, the decisions that had felt like his own, the expansions that had seemed like natural growth, the rivals who had failed in ways that had never quite made complete sense, the opportunities that had appeared at exactly the right moments. Thought about all of it, and he felt something happen in his chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite fury, and wasn't quite either of those things. It was the particular sensation of a man who has just realized that the room he thought he owned has another door in it he never found. "Where is Kane now?" he said. "I don't know. He's not a man who stays findable. Find him." Carmine nodded and left. Dante stood alone in his study for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called the number he'd been avoiding since 9 that morning, the one Ricci had given him as a possible contact point, marked with the note that it might or might not go anywhere. It rang twice. "I wondered when you'd call." Elara's voice was steady and quiet, the same voice she'd used in their kitchen, at his table, at the edge of rooms where men with guns made plans. No differently than she'd ever spoken to him. Dante's jaw tightened. "Where are you?" "Somewhere I can think." "I need to talk to you." "I know," a pause. "But you're not ready yet." "Don't," he stopped. Breathed. Started again. "I found the files." "All 41? The number hit him like a physical thing. He hadn't told anyone how many there were. He hadn't told anyone he'd found them at all. "You knew I'd look," he said. "I knew you couldn't not look. It's not in your nature to sit with an incomplete picture." Her voice didn't carry any satisfaction in this, just the flat accuracy of a woman stating a thing she had observed over years. "What did you find this morning?" "Victor, and?" "The accounts he flagged as mine, they traced to him. 8 months of draws. Carmen has the records." He paused. "And Kane." Silence on the line. A different quality of silence than before, not waiting, but considering. "You found Kane," she said. "A name in the routing chains. 3rd and 4th hop." He waited. "You knew about Kane." "I've known about Kane for 2 years." Something moved through him, not anger, not yet. Something until light changed. Something more architectural than anger. Something that was rearranging the structure of the last 6 years inside him and finding that the weight distribution was entirely different than he'd believed. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't have enough. A name in a routing chain isn't enough to move against a man like Kane. You need the full ledger. The complete transaction history. The evidence that traces every decision he's influenced, every operation he's compromised, every identity he's used." Her voice was precise. "I've been building that for 2 years. I'm close." "How close?" "Close enough that Kane knows someone is building it." A pause. "Which is why Victor moved last night. Kane told him to. Kane needs you off balance, needs the organization's internal attention pointed at me, and needs the ledger either in his possession or destroyed before I can deploy it." Dante was quiet. "Elara." His voice came out lower than he intended. "Did you know he was going to throw you out?" A pause long enough that he thought she might not answer. "I thought it was possible," she said. "Victor has been building the case against me for 3 months. I've watched him build it. I knew that if he moved, it was going to be fast, and it was going to be in front of the organization he needed witnesses, needed it public, so that even if you had doubts afterward, the social cost of reversing the decision would make you hesitate." Another pause. "I didn't know it would be last night specifically. But you had a bag packed." Silence, Elara. "I've had a bag packed for 8 months, she said quietly. "Not because I was planning to leave. Because I was planning for the possibility that I wouldn't have time to pack one." He didn't know what to do with that. He stood in his study with her voice in his ear and the 41 pages on his desk, and the folder Carmine had brought him, and he tried to construct a response that was adequate to the shape of what she'd just told him, and found that he didn't have one. "I need to see you," he said. "Not yet." "Elara, Dante, listen to me." Her voice sharpened slightly, not harsh, but direct. The voice of someone who needs the person on the other end to stop and hear the specific thing being said. "Victor is going to realize today that the accounts don't tell the story he wanted them to tell. When he does, he's going to go to Kane, and Kane is going to move. Not in 2 days today, tonight maybe." A pause. "You need to get your loyal people out of that estate before nightfall." He went very still. "How many men does Kane have?" "Enough. And they're not going to come to kill you." A beat. "They're coming for the ledger. They think I left it in the estate." "Did you?" "No." "Where is it?" "With me." He pressed his fingers against his eyes. He thought about the estate, the security, the men he trusted, the men he didn't, the layout of a building he'd lived in for 9 years, and thought he understood completely. "I have 8 men on property right now." "How many do you trust?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only honest way. He knew how to think about anything when it mattered. 3. Take 3 men and go. Her voice was quiet and final. Leave Victor in the dark about it. If he knows you're moving, he'll accelerate the timeline. And then what? Then wait for me to contact you. A pause. Trust me. The 2 words sat in the air between them across the phone line, across the morning, across 6 years of a marriage that he was only now beginning to understand the actual architecture of. He had thrown her out of his house at 2 in the morning in front of 12 witnesses because Victor had put a folder in his hands. He had been believing the wrong person for a long time. All right, he said. He ended the call and stood in the silence of his study for 30 seconds, looking at the 41 pages, looking at Carmine's folder, looking at the wedding ring that he had walked in here and set on the corner of his desk sometime in the early morning without thinking about it. Then he went to find Carmine. Victor called at 4:17. Dante let it ring to voicemail, listened to the message smooth, unhurried. Victor saying he'd pulled the records Dante asked for and could come by the state this evening to go over them, and then deleted it. He was already in the car. Carmine was driving. In the back with Dante were 2 other men, Reyes, who had been with him since the early years and whose loyalty was of the simple, non-transferable variety, and a younger man named Tay, who had the particular gift of being able to move through the city without being remembered. 3 men. The ones he trusted without a calculation attached. He had told no one else they were leaving. He had told Victor's contact in the household, a man named Vercelli, who managed the estate security system, that he was staying in for the evening and needed the cameras on the north perimeter checked. By the time Vercelli reported that to Victor, which Dante now assumed he would, they would already be gone. The estate receded in the side mirror. Dante watched it shrink and then disappear as Carmine turned onto the expressway, and he felt something he hadn't expected, not relief, not fear, but a peculiar lightness, the sensation of a man who has just put down something very heavy that he didn't know he was carrying. Phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, a different one than the call earlier. Just an address in Pilsen and a time, 10 p.m., no signature. He didn't need one. He showed it to Carmine, who glanced at it and said nothing. They drove south through the afternoon city, past the places where Dante's organization had operated for 15 years, past the streets he knew by density and weight and the particular quality of how power settled into them. He had believed this city was something he had built. He was beginning to understand that he had been, for a very long time, building something for someone else living in it, maintaining it, making it profitable, while the real architect sat at a distance and collected what the structure produced. Kane. He turned the name over in his mind like a stone, looking at its underside. He had 5 hours until the address in Pilsen. He used them, thinking through everything he knew and everything he'd assumed and the difference between those 2 categories, which turned out to be much larger than he had believed before this morning. At 9:55, Carmen pulled onto a street in Pilsen that looked quiet and forgotten, the kind of block a city metabolizes without noticing. A house with lights off at the front, and somewhere behind it, the faint suggestion of something alive. Dante got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the night air cold now, the storm's residue still in it. He thought about the last 24 hours. He thought about a woman removing her ring with the steadiness of someone who had already done the calculation. He walked to the door. Before he could knock, it opened. Margot looked at him with the flat assessment of someone who has read a detailed file on a person and is now comparing it to the original. She said nothing, just stepped back to let him in. He went down the stairs. Elara was standing at a table covered in screens and documents, a phone in her hand, speaking quietly to someone in a language he recognized as a dialect used in certain intelligence communities, the kind of language that didn't appear in tourist books. She finished the call, set the phone down, and turned to look at him. She looked tired. Not broken. Elara Vela didn't break in directions. You could see, but tired, in the specific way of someone who has been holding something together through will alone for a very long time and is measuring very carefully how much is left. He looked at her across the room and didn't know where to start. So he started with the thing that had been sitting in him since 9 that morning. Why did you marry me? He said. The room went quiet. The two other women at the consoles didn't look up, but their stillness changed in quality. Elara held his eyes. You want the honest answer, she said. I want the only answer. She was quiet for a moment, not composing herself. She didn't need to. Just deciding how much to give him and in what order. 7 years ago, she said, my family was killed. My mother, my father, and my younger brother. It was staged to look like a robbery. She paused. It wasn't. Dante said nothing. He didn't move. Someone inside your organization ordered it, she said. I spent a year trying to find out who. The trail kept leading back to the Vercelli structure, not to you specifically, but to people around you. People who were protected by your position. A pause. I made the decision to get close enough to find the truth. You married me to investigate my organization. I married you because it was the only way to stay close enough. Long enough without being exposed. Her voice was steady. And then she stopped. And then what? And then I discovered that the person who ordered my family killed had also been systematically setting you up, using your organization to run operations you didn't authorize, then ensuring the evidence pointed at you. She looked at him directly. You were being framed, Dante, for years, by the same person who killed my family. The silence in the room was complete. Cain, Dante said. Cain, she confirmed. He stood very still. He thought about 15 years of decisions, of consequences, of things that had seemed like his own choices. He thought about the weight of what she was telling him, that his empire had been a theater, and the play running in it had been written by someone else. He thought about her, staying 6 years, watching and documenting and protecting, and never once telling him. You could have told me, he said. His voice came out rougher than he wanted it to. When? She wasn't being confrontational. She was asking a genuine question. When would you have believed me? In the first year, when you barely knew me. In the third year, when Victor was already in your ear. Last week? A pause. You needed to find it yourself, in the right sequence. Or you would have handed everything I built straight to the person I built it against. He looked at her for a long time. The ledger, he said. You said you have it. Yes. What's in it? Everything. 15 years of Cain's operations. Every payment, every instruction, every name he used, and every name he burned. Every crime that was committed in your name that you didn't order. She held his gaze. It's enough to end him. Completely and permanently. Then why haven't you used it? Because I was waiting. She stopped. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Her expression changed in a way that was slight and specific, not fear, but the controlled alertness of someone receiving information they were prepared for, but hoping not to receive yet. She looked up at him. Victor just arrived at the estate, she said. With 14 men, Dante felt his jaw tighten. They're not finding what they came for, he said. No, Elara said. But they're going to figure that out in about 20 minutes. She looked at him with the steadiness of a woman who had run the numbers on this scenario and knew exactly what came next. And when they do, Cain is going to know you've been warned. She picked up the ledger from the table, physical, thick, rubber-banded, the accumulated evidence of 2 years of work, and held it in both hands. Which means we have until morning, she said before he comes for this himself. The room held its breath. Outside, somewhere in the city, Victor Rusk was standing in an empty estate with 14 armed men, realizing that the man he had just tried to trap was already gone, and that the woman he had framed was not running at all. She was waiting, and Dante Vercelli, standing in a basement in Pilsen, with the ruins of everything all thought he knew arranged around him, made the only decision left that was entirely his own. The basement in Pilsen felt smaller, with 14 armed men, standing inside an empty estate 12 miles north. Dante watched Elara set the ledger back on the table. She didn't put it down the way a person puts down something they're finished with. Put it down the way a person puts down something they intend to pick up again very soon. And the precision of that small gesture told him more about her state of mind than anything she'd said in the last 20 minutes. Margot was already on comms. She had a headset on and was speaking in low, flat sentences to someone Dante couldn't identify. Her eyes moving across 3 screens simultaneously with the practiced economy of someone who had done this exactly. Crisis management in real time, more times than she'd care to count. Danny had the financial architecture pulled up on her screen and was running a trace, her pen moving fast across a notepad in the shorthand of someone whose thinking moved faster than standard notation could capture. Prize was standing near the stairs with her coat already on. Dante looked at all of this, the equipment, the organization, the quiet professional competence of 3 women running an operation inside a basement in a neighborhood where nobody looked twice at anything, and felt something shift in him that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite shame, and was probably some compound of both that he didn't have a clean word for. "How long have you had this set up?" he said. "Long enough." Elara was pulling on a jacket. "Victor has men on the south side of the estate, Margot." "Tell me the north perimeter." "Clear," Margot said without looking up. "But the 2-block radius around the estate is getting traffic. Unmarked cars, rotating. Someone's running a net." "Kane's people," Elara said. "Not a question. Has to be. Victor's crew doesn't have the coordination for that pattern. This is a professional cordon." Dante processed this. Cordon meant they weren't just looking for the ledger inside the estate. They were covering the surrounding area, which meant Kane had anticipated that Dante might already be gone, which meant Kane's intelligence on Dante's movements was better than Dante had realized. "Someone in my 3, he said. Elara looked at him. "Carmine, Reyes, Tay." One of them reported to Kane. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, a tiredness. The specific exhaustion of a man who keeps discovering that the circle of people he trusts is smaller than the circle he drew. "Or someone who saw you leave," Elara said carefully. "Doesn't have to be one of your 3. Vercelli. He's Victor's, which makes him Kane's." Yes. Dante thought about Vercelli, a mid-40s man, with a steady manner and a thorough knowledge of the estate's security systems. A man Dante had vetted personally 2 years ago and found clean. He thought about what clean meant, when the person doing the vetting was also, in some measure, being managed by the person the vetting was supposed to catch. He thought about Marcellus Kane sitting at a distance from all of it, pulling the thread. "We need to move the ledger," he said. "We need to move everything," Elara said. "This location has a window of maybe 3 hours before Kane's people sweep south into Pilsen. They'll work outward from the estate." She looked at Margot. Extraction sequence. Margot pulled a laminated card from the console drawer, an actual physical card, low-tech, the kind of thing that couldn't be hacked, and began reading from it in a quiet voice. Backup locations, contact numbers, protocols for moving equipment and personnel under active surveillance. The whole thing had the quality of something that had been designed, tested, and revised over a long period of time by someone who took contingency planning seriously. Dante stood in the middle of all this preparation and made himself be useful instead of ornamental. "I have a property on the west side," he said. "Off the books. It's not in anything Victor has access to. I acquired it through a third party 4 years ago." Elara looked at him. "Carmine knows about it?" "No one knows about it." "Then it's clean." She held his eyes for a moment. That flat assessment he was beginning to recognize as her default mode, not cold, just precise. Measuring what he was giving her against what it cost him to give it. "Address," he told her. She passed it to Margot without writing it down. 15 minutes later, they were moving. The West Side property was a converted warehouse space above a legitimate dry cleaning operation that Dante had purchased through 4 layers of shell documentation, specifically because it was the kind of acquisition that blended into the background of ordinary commercial real estate. He had never used it operationally. He had held it the way careful men hold things for the day. The thing you never planned for happens. That day had apparently arrived. They came in through the back, 2 vehicles, no lights, on the upper level until Margot had swept the immediate exterior and confirmed the area was clean. The space inside was large and cold and smelled of cleaning solvent from the floor below, and it had nothing in it except some folding tables that the previous tenant had left and a working electrical system that Dante had maintained on the same principle as everything else here quietly, through intermediaries, for a contingency he hadn't defined yet. Danny set up the portable equipment in 20 minutes. Margot ran comms from a secondary system that Elara told Dante was completely separate from anything that had ever touched the Bella Vita Estates network. Dante sent Carmine and Reyes to 2 separate locations he trusted and told them to stay dark until he contacted them. He sent Tay to watch a specific intersection near the estate and report any movement without engaging anyone under any circumstances. Then he sat down across from Elara at a folding table with a ledger between them and said, "Tell me everything." She did. It took an hour and 40 minutes. She talked, and he listened, and occasionally asked a specific question, and she answered it without deflecting. By the end of it, he had a picture of the last 15 years of his own life that was so different from the picture he'd been carrying that it felt like looking at a photograph of a place you've lived in and realizing the photograph was taken from an angle you never found yourself. Kane had identified Dante 12 years ago not as a target, but as a vehicle. A young, ambitious, capable operator with enough legitimate ruthlessness to build an organization and enough pride to believe he was doing it entirely on his own. Kane had provided infrastructure, shell companies, financial architecture, introductions to suppliers and distributors who were already inside Kane's network. He had done this invisibly through layers of intermediaries, presenting each piece of assistance as market opportunity or good fortune rather than orchestration. The organization Dante had built was, in Kane's accounting, an asset he owned. The crimes Dante had committed or believed he'd committed were, in Kane's accounting, leverage. The Meridian operation, Dante said, 3 years ago. The alderman. Elara nodded. Kane. He needed the contract rerouted, and he needed political cover in the Second Ward. The alderman's involvement was framed to look like it came from your organization. It did come through your organization, through Victor, through 2 of your men who didn't know whose instruction they were actually following. And if the alderman had ever talked, he would have talked about Vercelli, not Kane. She held his eyes. You would have taken the fall for every significant crime this organization has committed in the last decade. Kane would have been invisible. He's been building that insulation since before you knew his name. Dante was quiet for a long time. Across the room, Margot said, without turning, "We've got movement near the Pilsen location." Everyone looked at her. "How close?" Elara asked. 2 blocks. They found it faster than projected. A pause. Someone gave them the location. The room went very still. Dante felt it go through him, the specific cold of that sentence. Someone gave them the location. Not traffic patterns, not surveillance sweeps, not professional thoroughness. Someone who knew. He looked at Elara. She was already looking at him. Her expression was controlled, but her jaw was tight, and her eyes had the focused quality of someone running rapidly through a short list. "The address you gave Margot," Dante said. "Who heard it?" "Everyone in this room at the time." Elara's voice was steady. "You, me, Margot, Danny, Pris." A pause. "And Carmine." "Carmine was upstairs. He came down the stairs when you were giving the address. I saw him on the landing." She paused. "I didn't think. He's been with me for 9 years. I know. He was with me before Victor. Before any of this, I know Dante." He pressed both hands flat on the table. He breathed through it, the tight, hot thing that wanted to be rage and couldn't afford to be. Not right now. Not when rage was just noise, and what the situation required was clarity. He breathed and got himself back down to something workable. "He's not with Kane," he said. "Not defending Carmine, working through it. Carmine doesn't have the connections. He doesn't think in those terms." "Victor," Elara said quietly. Victor turned him. Not Kane directly. It was worse somehow than Kane. Kane was distant and architectural, a threat Dante could handle with the abstract coldness of strategy. Victor and Carmine were people he had sat across tables from, eaten with, made decisions with. People whose judgment and loyalty he had weighed and trusted and built his understanding of the world around. Picked up his phone and called Tay. 1 ring. 2. 3. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. "Tay's not answering," he said. Margot turned fully from her console. "The intersection you sent him to watch, that's 2 blocks from the Pilsen location." Her voice was careful. If Kane's people swept that area, he was supposed to watch and stay dark. Dante was already standing. He knew not to engage. If they made him before he could pull back, the sentence didn't need finishing. Dante stood very still for a moment. The weight of the evening settled on him in a specific way, not the dramatic, cinematic weight of revelation, but the mundane, grinding weight of consequence. Real consequences, attached to real people, moving through the city right now in directions he couldn't fully see or control. He had sent Tay to that intersection. He had made that call. He put the phone in his pocket and sat back down and looked at Elara and said, "What do you need from me right now?" Specifically, she looked at him for a moment, measuring, as she always measured. But this time with something slightly different in it. Something that might have been the early stages of trust or the recognition of trust offered and being considered. "I need you to call Victor," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Call Victor. Tell him you've reconsidered. Tell him you want to meet tonight, somewhere neutral. Tell him you want to hear his side of the documentation before you make any decisions." She held his gaze. "Make him believe you're wavering. You want me to bring Victor in. I want Victor to think he's winning. As long as he thinks he's winning, he stays in the open. The moment he realizes he's losing, he goes to ground and we lose our line to Kane." She picked up the ledger. "Victor is the only person who can give us Kane's current location. He won't give it willingly, but if he thinks he's managing you, he'll be careless about what he reveals." Dante thought about it for a moment. He thought about what it would cost him not strategically, but in the simpler currency of pride, and the specific injury of performing deference to a man who had been betraying him for 8 months. The version of himself that had run this organization for 15 years recoiled from it. He thought about 41 surveillance files and a ledger that could end Kane, and he swallowed the recoil. Called Victor. Victor answered on the second ring, which told Dante that Victor had been waiting, that Victor's phone was already in his hand, that the call from Dante was something he'd been anticipating and had prepared for. The warmth in Victor's voice, when he answered, had the very slightly practiced quality of a man who has rehearsed being pleasantly surprised. "Dante, I was worried. I needed time to think," Dante said. He kept his voice tired, which was not difficult, because he was exhausted and faintly uncertain, which required more construction. "Files I found last night, the surveillance records. I heard you pulled some additional records this morning." Victor's voice was neutral. Carmine mentioned it, so Carmine had been reporting in real time. Dante filed that and kept his voice level. "I don't know what to think, Victor. There's a lot here that doesn't line up." "I know. That's why I wanted to sit down with you this evening. The records I have, I want to meet tonight." Dante let a pause in the hesitation of a man making a decision he's not entirely sure about. "Somewhere I can think, not the estate." A brief silence on Victor's end. "Calculating, of course." "Where?" "The dockside. A legitimate restaurant in the River North District, one Dante had used for meetings that required neutral ground, public enough to feel safe, private enough for real conversation." "What time?" "Midnight." Another brief pause. "I'll be there." And then, with the precisely calibrated warmth of a man who understood that this moment required a human note, "Dante, I know this has been hard, but we'll work through it." Dante ended the call. He set the phone on the table. He looked at Elara. "He agreed immediately," he said. "Of course he did. He needs you in the room where he can manage you." She was already looking at Margot. "Pull everything we have on the dockside. Entrance points, blind spots, any existing surveillance coverage on the exterior." "Already on it," Margot said. Dante rubbed the back of his neck. The exhaustion was real now, not the clean adrenaline-sharpened alertness of earlier, but the deeper, structural fatigue of a man who had been running on crisis for 20 hours and was beginning to feel the ground beneath the sprint. "Victor is going to bring people." "Yes. He'll stage them outside. He won't bring them in. Not somewhere that public." "Not somewhere that public." Elara pulled a chair around and sat at the table beside him, that he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She had been awake longer than him. She had been running this longer than him. Still looked more contained than he felt. "We need Victor to give us one thing. Not the ledger, he doesn't have it. Not Kane's location directly, because Victor is smart enough not to say it outright." She paused. "We need a contact point. A name, a number, an address that connects Victor to Kane in a way that can be verified. If we have that, we have the link that ties the financial records to Kane directly. And you think he'll give it to you in a restaurant conversation?" "I think he'll give it to me when he thinks he's giving it to someone else." She looked at him. "I won't be at the restaurant." "You will, but I'll be listening. and I'll be able to direct the conversation in real time if you have an earpiece. He looked at her. You've done this before. I've done variations of it. A pause. Key is that Victor needs to feel in control. As long as he thinks he's managing you, he talks. The moment he senses the frame of the conversation shifting, he'll close down. She held his gaze. You have to let him manage you. Genuinely. Not performed if it's performed. He'll catch it. You have to actually sit in the feeling of being uncertain and let him work with it. You're asking me to be vulnerable in front of Victor Rusk. I'm asking you to use it as a tool. He almost smiled. You know that's the hardest thing you've asked me tonight. I know. No apology in it. Just acknowledgement. He nodded once. At 10:40, Pris came back in from outside with a look on her face that Dante had not seen on her before, tight, controlled, but with something underneath it that he classified, from long experience reading people under pressure, as genuine distress held together by discipline. She looked at Elara first. Tay, she said. Dante went very still. He's alive, Pris said quickly, and Dante felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known he was holding. But they have him. Kane's people picked him up outside the Pilsen location. He's being held at a property on the north side. We got a location through a secondary contact. They'll question him, Margot said. He doesn't know anything, Dante said. I sent him to watch an intersection. He doesn't know about this location. Doesn't know about Elara. Doesn't know about the ledger. He knows you left the estate, Elara said. Her voice was careful. He knows you have trusted people moving. That's enough for Kane to know you've been warned. She paused, which means the midnight meeting with Victor just became more complicated. How? Because if Kane knows you've been warned, he's going to tell Victor. And if Victor walks into that restaurant knowing you've been warned, he's not going to be managing you. He's going to be stalling you while Kane moves somewhere else. Dante thought through it. So Victor becomes a decoy, or Victor becomes a threat. Her eyes were steady. Kane doesn't need Victor anymore. If Victor is a liability, if he's been exposed or is about to be, Kane will cut him the same way he cuts everyone who stops being useful. Victor doesn't know that, Dante said. Noah, pause. And that's the last piece of leverage we have. He understood what she was saying before she finished the sentence. You want me to tell Victor that Kane is going to burn him. I want you to show Victor the evidence. Tonight. At midnight, she reached for the ledger. Not all of it. Enough. Enough for Victor to understand that Kane has been documenting his own exposure, that the same financial architecture Kane used to frame you has also been built to frame Victor if the situation requires it. She opened the ledger to a specific section, tabbed. He noticed, with small strips of that she had clearly placed carefully at specific points. Victor has a son. 23, lives in Seattle. Stays out of all of this by agreement. Dante looked at her. You're going to threaten his son. Kane is going to threaten his son. I'm going to show Victor the order Kane has already prepared. She laid the open ledger on the table. The page she'd turned to showed a document original, not a copy bearing a structure that Dante recognized as the kind of internal authorization that certain organizations used for certain kinds of decisions. Names, addresses, contingency protocols. Kane drafted this 4 months ago. Victor's son is on it as leverage to be used if Victor became a problem. The room was completely silent. Victor doesn't know about this document, Dante said. No. How did you get it? Kane's financial handler has been running a secondary set of books for personal insurance purposes for 2 years. He made contact with me 8 months ago. A pause. He wanted a guarantee of protection in exchange for access, and you gave it to him. I gave him what I could give him. Her voice was level, which wasn't everything he wanted, but enough. Dante looked at the document. He looked at the page with Victor's son's name and address on it, prepared by a man who treated people as contingency instruments and discarded them when the calculus changed. He thought about Tay sitting in a room on the north side right now, being held by people who would make similar calculations about what he was worth and what happened when that worth ran out. He thought about what he had been, what Kane had built him to be, and what it would mean to choose at this specific moment to be something else. If I show Victor this, he said, and it works if Victor gives us Kane, what happens to Victor? Elara looked at him steadily. What do you want to happen to Victor? It was the first time she had asked him what he wanted. Not what was strategic, Not what the situation required, not what the calculus produced, what he wanted. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about anything that mattered. I want him to face what he did, he said. Not from me. Properly. She nodded once. Then that's what we worked toward. At 11:15, Dante's phone rang. Unknown number different from the ones Elara used, different from any contact he recognized. He looked at Elara. She nodded, he answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice older, careful, the voice of a man who had learned to speak in rooms where every word was recorded and had shaped his speech accordingly. Warm without being warm. Present without being traceable. Dante, said Marcellus Kane, I think it's time we spoke directly. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. Across the table, Elara went absolutely still. She had heard the voice. He could see it in the way her body locked, not from fear, but from the particular physical response of someone who has been tracking a target for 2 years and has just heard it speak for the first time in the open. I think you're right, Dante said. Good. A pause, measured and deliberate. I want you to understand something before we go further. I have nothing against you personally. Everything that has happened has been structural. The organization requires certain adjustments from time to time, and you've reached a point where adjustment is necessary. Another pause. But I'm not unreasonable. What I need is the ledger. Everything your wife has compiled. In exchange, I can offer you a very comfortable exit financial security, a clean separation from everything that could expose you legally, and the guarantee that no one in your family circle is touched. Dante said nothing. The meeting with Victor tonight, Kane continued. Cancel it. It's unnecessary, and it will only complicate things for everyone. A pause. What I'm offering is simple. One exchange. The ledger for your freedom. The warmth in his voice was precise and professional. You've been carrying this organization for 15 years, Dante. Isn't that enough? Dante looked at Elara across the table. She was watching him with the steady, complete attention of someone who understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds would determine the shape of everything that came after. Thought about what Kane was offering. He ran the calculation, the version of the calculation that the man Kane had built would run, the one that prioritized survival and personal security and the clean exit from a burning building. That version of the calculation came to a clear answer. He thought about 41 surveillance files and a woman who had spent 6 years protecting something he'd never thanked her for protecting. He thought about Tay, held on the north side. He thought about what it meant to face what you'd done properly. No, he said. A silence on Kane's end, short-controlled. The silence of a man recalibrating. That's a significant decision, Kane said carefully. I know what it is. The meeting with Victor stands. His voice was flat and final. And I'm bringing the ledger. He ended the call. The room was completely quiet for 2 full seconds. Then Margot said, he's going to accelerate everything now. We have maybe 2 hours before he repositions completely. Elara was still looking at Dante. Something had changed in her expression, not dramatically, because Elara Vile did not do dramatic, but at the edges of it, something had shifted. Something that recognized what he had just given up and what he had chosen instead. 2 hours, she said. She reached for the ledger. Then we need to be at that restaurant before Victor is. Stood up. She moved to the equipment and began disassembling what needed to be moved. Her hands quick and certain, and Dante watched her work for a moment, the woman who had spent 6 years inside his world, holding it from the end, inside without his knowledge or his thanks, and felt the full weight of it settle on him in a way that had nothing strategic in it. Then he stood up and went to help her. Because in 2 hours, Marcellus Kane was going to move every piece he had left on the board, and the only thing standing between Kane and everything he'd built over 40 years of invisible architecture was a ledger, a woman who'd been carrying it alone, and a man who had finally at the worst possible moment, and the only possible moment, decided to stop being what someone else had built him to be. They left the West Side property at 11:20 with the ledger in a waterproof case that Elara carried herself and did not hand to anyone. Dante noticed that. He noticed the way her left arm stayed close to her body when she moved, the case hanging from her shoulder with the particular tension of someone who has decided that a thing stays with them, regardless of what happens, not because they don't trust the people around them, But because they understand that the moment you outsource the most critical element of a plan, you have introduced a variable you can no longer control. He had operated on the same principle for 15 years. He just hadn't known, until tonight, that she operated on it too. Margot drove. Chris took a separate vehicle, a clean car, unregistered to anything connected to either of them, and positioned herself 2 blocks west of the dockside, with a line of sight to the restaurant's secondary entrance and a phone that connected directly to Margot's earpiece. Danny stayed at the west side property with the equipment, running remote surveillance on the restaurant's surrounding blocks from traffic cameras, and a secondary feed she'd tapped into through a city infrastructure access point that Dante chose not to ask too many questions about. Reyes was already in position inside the restaurant. He'd gone in at 10:30 as a late dinner customer, sat at the bar, and had been nursing a drink and reading the room for 50 minutes by the time Dante and Elara arrived through the kitchen entrance at 11:40. The dockside was the kind of restaurant that stayed open until 2, the kind of place that understood its client ran on a different clock than the rest of the city, that certain conversations happened better after midnight, when the ambient noise of a half-empty room provided cover without requiring privacy. Dante had used it for exactly that purpose 6 times in the last 4 years. Victor had used it too, he now understood, for conversations Dante hadn't known about. The kitchen entrance brought them through a narrow corridor past the prep station's stainless steel, the smell of reduced stock and industrial cleaning fluid, 2 line cooks who looked up briefly and looked back down, the particular urban discretion of people who understood that certain things that happened in certain restaurants were not their business. Dante had an arrangement with the owner that was older than most of his current problems. Elara stopped in the corridor just before the door to the dining room and turned to him. "Earpiece," she said. She held it out small, almost invisible at distance, the kind of thing that required knowing it was there to see it. Took it, put it in. The fit was good, which meant she'd had it made at some point to specifications. "I'll be in the back booth the corner," she said. "You won't be able to see me from the main table, and Victor won't look for me, because Victor thinks I'm in the wind." She held his eyes. "Let him talk. Don't push the cane angle until he's comfortable. He'll get there on his own if you give him room. And if he doesn't come alone, Reyes will have eyes on whoever walks in with him. Prize has the secondary exit covered." A pause. "If something goes wrong." Define wrong. "If Victor walks in with more than 2 people, he's not here to negotiate. He's here to contain you. In that case, you get up and walk to the bar. And Reyes gets you out the secondary." Her voice was precise and calm, the voice of someone who has run the decision tree on this multiple times and is now delivering the conclusions. "The ledger comes with me regardless. And Kane? Kane is watching this meeting through Victor. Whatever Victor sees tonight, Kane sees." She paused. "Which means we have exactly 1 shot at making Kane believe he's still ahead of us." Dante looked at her in the narrow corridor with the kitchen noise behind them and the dining room ahead, and he said, "What do you need me to do if it goes right? When Victor gives you the contact point a name, a number, anything that links him directly to Kane, repeat it out loud, naturally, in the flow of the conversation. Don't make it obvious. Just say it aloud so I can hear it. And then I'll have what I need to move." She adjusted the strap of the case on her shoulder. 20 minutes, Dante. "Give me 20 minutes from the moment you have the contact point." He nodded. She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then she moved past him toward the corner booth. He pushed through the door into the dining room. Victor arrived at 3 minutes past midnight. He came in through the front entrance, which Dante had expected. Victor was a man who used front entrances, because front entrances were what people who had nothing to hide used, and Victor had been performing having nothing to hide for so long that it had become a genuine behavioral default. He was wearing a dark coat, open, a good suit underneath. He came in with 1 man, a tall, quiet individual named Gregor, who served as Victor's personal security and who positioned himself at the bar with the practiced invisibility of someone who had done this many times and understood that his job tonight was to be present without being visible. 1 man, which meant Victor had come here believing he was in control of the room. Dante watched him cross the floor and felt the particular quality of looking at someone you've known for years and discovering that you're seeing them clearly for the first time, not because they've changed, but because the thing distorting your view of them has been removed. Victor moved the same way he always moved. Said hello to the host by name, touched the man's shoulder briefly, the practiced warmth of a man who understood that small social investments paid compound returns. He found Dante's table without looking for it, which meant he'd known exactly where Dante would be sitting, which meant someone had told him, which meant the arrangements for this meeting had been more thoroughly managed on Victor's end than Dante had indicated. He sat down across from Dante, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "You look better," Victor said. "A few hours of rest." "I didn't rest." "No." Victor studied him. "You look like you've been thinking." "That's accurate." A waiter came. Victor ordered, without looking at the menu. He'd been here enough times to know it, and leaned back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man who believed he was about to have a conversation he had already won. Dante recognized the posture because he had used it himself. It was the posture of someone who had arranged the furniture before the other person arrived. "Files you found," Victor said. "I want to address them directly." "Go ahead." "Someone has been running a shadow operation inside your organization. The surveillance files, the financial rerouting, the anonymous warnings, all of it traces back to Elara. I know that's not easy to hear." His voice was measured and warm. "Pattern is consistent. Whoever was running that operation was protecting certain assets and exposing others. And the assets that kept getting protected were always the ones that connected back to her." Dante kept his face still. "Which assets specifically?" "The Meridian account, the contingency funds, the secondary distribution chain in the north side." Victor listed them with the confidence of someone who had prepared this list. Every time those assets were at risk, they moved. Cleanly, before anyone should have known they were at risk. "Someone with foreknowledge," Dante said. "Exactly." Victor nodded. "Which tells you?" "It tells me someone knew about the threats before they materialized." "Yes, which tells you the person running the shadow operation was getting intelligence from inside the organization." Dante paused, or was inside the organization themselves. A very small silence. "Elara had access," Victor said carefully. "So did you," Dante said. His voice was completely level. "So did I. So did every senior member of this organization." He picked up his glass. "Access alone doesn't build a case, Victor." Something shifted in Victor's eyes, the faintest recalibration. The adjustment of a man who has realized the conversation is not running on exactly the track he planned, but who is experienced enough to adjust in motion. "You're looking for an alternative explanation." "I'm looking for the right one, Dante." The warmth in Victor's voice deepened slightly. The move of a man reaching for a more personal register, trying to bring the conversation down from the analytical to the emotional. "I understand what it costs to believe this. She's been with you for 6 years. You trusted her. That's not nothing. And I'm not asking you to feel nothing about it." He leaned forward slightly. "But the evidence." "Tell me about Kane," Dante said. The words landed in the space between them, like something dropped on a hard floor, sudden, flat, impossible to ignore. Victor went very still. Not long, a half-second, maybe less. But Dante was watching for it, and he saw it. The fractional freeze of a man whose prepared script has just been departed from, in a direction he wasn't ready for. "I'm sorry," Victor said. "Marcellus Kane." Dante set his glass down. "He called me tonight. A few hours ago. Made me an offer." He kept his voice conversational, tired, slightly bewildered. The voice of a man trying to understand something that's bigger than he expected. "I'm trying to understand how Kane fits into what you're describing." Victor was quiet for 3 full seconds. Long for him. "Where did you hear that name?" he said finally. "Kane said it. On the phone." Dante frowned slightly, performed confusion, but grounded in genuine fatigue, which Elara had told him was the key. Let the real tiredness carry the performance. He said the organization needed adjustment. He said you were. He stopped, shook his head. He made it sound like this whole situation was something he'd been managing for a while. Victor's jaw moved. Dante lowered his voice, made it quieter, more uncertain. "How long has Kane been involved in what's been happening?" Question was carefully constructed to imply that Dante was asking for clarification, not accusation. that he was a confused man trying to map a situation that had gotten bigger than he understood, that he needed Victor to explain it to him. Victor looked at him for a long moment, and then, with the slow, careful movements of a man making a decision he has been avoiding, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a phone. He set it face down on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at Dante. Kane has been involved, Victor said, his voice dropping to a register that was almost private. Since before you took over the organization. Dante said nothing. Let the silence do the work. He came to me 8 years ago, Victor continued. You were still building, the organization was growing, and Kane could see what it was going to become. He approached me because he understood that the person closest to you was the person with the most influence over your decisions. A pause. He didn't ask me to work against you. Not at first. What did he ask? Information. Strategic positioning. Which direction you were likely to move. Which relationships were most important to you. What your vulnerabilities were. Victor's voice was careful and quiet, the voice of a man confessing something he has been carrying for a long time, and is only now allowing himself to put down. It seemed manageable. He was a senior figure, someone who'd been in this world before either of us, someone with connections I thought could benefit the organization. He stopped. I told myself it was intelligence sharing. That's what I called it. It wasn't. No. Victor picked up the face down, turned it over, set it back down without unlocking it. Over time, Kane's requests became more specific. He wanted certain operations to go a particular way. He wanted certain people elevated and others sidelined. He stopped again. He wanted the organization shaped in a way that made it maximally useful to him, without you understanding that it was being shaped. Dante let a beat pass in Bracco. Victor's face changed. Something went out of it, not guilt, exactly, but the structural support that guilt required. Like a man who has been holding a position through effort and has just run out of the energy to keep holding it. Bracco figured out the account draws. He was going to bring it to you. So Kane told you to handle it. Victor looked at the table. Victor. Dante's voice was quiet. Did you know what handling it meant? A long silence. I knew, Victor said. The two words sat in the air between them with all their weight. Dante breathed through it, through the thing that wanted to come up and out, the thing that had Bracco's face attached to it, and 9 years of a working relationship, and the specific injury of understanding that trust, in this particular case, had been the mechanism of a man's death. He breathed and kept his hands flat on the table and kept his voice level. Phone, Dante said. The one on the table. Is that how you contact Kane? Victor looked at the phone for a moment. There's a number in it, he said. Third contact from the top. It doesn't go directly to Kane, it goes to an intermediary. The intermediary relays everything immediately. He paused. Closest thing to a direct line that exists. Dante looked at the phone. In his ear he heard Elara's voice quiet, barely above a breath. Say the name of the contact. He looked at Victor. What's the intermediary's name? Victor was quiet. Dante leaned forward very slightly. I need you to understand something. Kane called me tonight because he wanted the ledger. He offered me an exit money, safety, separation from everything. A pause. He didn't mention you. Something moved across Victor's face. He's already decided you're a liability, Dante said. It was not a weapon, he delivered it flatly, with the affect of someone stating a structural fact rather than trying to wound. The offer he made me didn't include any arrangement for you, which means the moment this situation resolves in his favor, you are the evidence that connects him to everything that happened. He let that sit, including Bracco. Victor's jaw was tight. His hand on the table was very still, the stillness of someone holding themselves together by constricting the physical expression of what they were feeling. His name is Rourke, Victor said quietly. Bennett Rourke. He operates out of a property in Evanston, a private residence, not commercial. Kane uses it as a staging point when he's in the city. He paused. Kane is there right now. Has been since this afternoon. In his ear, almost inaudible, got it. Dante sat back. He looked at Victor Rusk across the table, the man who had been at his right shoulder for 9 years, who had attended dinners and funerals and decisions, and the small rituals of an organizational life, who had been simultaneously one of the most constant presences in his world, and a channel through which that world had been systematically drained of what he thought it was. The evidence Elara has compiled, Dante said. It documents Kane, but it also documents you. Victor said nothing. I'm not in a position to offer you anything, Dante continued. I don't have that kind of authority anymore. I don't think I ever really did, if I'm being honest. He paused. But there are people who can make determinations about cooperation and what it's worth. And you giving me Rourke's name and Kane's location, that's a starting point. Victor looked at him for a long moment. His eyes had the quality of someone who has been running fast for a long time and has just stopped moving and is only now beginning to understand how tired they are. What happens now? Victor said. Now you stay here, Dante said. Don't call anyone. Don't contact Kane or Rourke. Sit here and wait. He pushed his chair back. Reyes is at the bar. He'll stay with you. Victor looked toward the bar, found Reyes, looked back at Dante. You planned this, Victor said. Not accusatory, just recognizing it. Someone did, Dante said. He stood up, dropped cash on the table, and walked toward the kitchen entrance without looking back. Elara was already moving when he came through the kitchen door. She had the case in one hand and her phone in the other and was talking to Margot in the rapid, compressed shorthand of someone who has just received actionable information and is converting it a movement in real time. Evanston, Dante said. I heard. Margot is running the Rourke property now. She looked up from the phone. Kane has been there since this afternoon, which means he positioned before he called you. He was already expecting this to go wrong for Victor. He's prepared to move. He's prepared to disappear. Evanston is not a permanent base, it's a transit point. He uses it, then leaves. She was walking toward the back exit fast, Dante matching her pace. If Kane decides tonight that the ledger is beyond his reach, and the exposure is too great, he will be out of that property before sunrise, and out of this city before noon, and we will never get close enough to him again. Carmine's car was waiting in the alley behind the restaurant. Reyes had positioned it before coming inside. Margot was behind the wheel. They got in. How far is the Evanston property? Dante said. 35 minutes with no traffic. Margot pulled out of the alley without hesitation. 22 if I drive the way I used to drive. Drive the way you used to drive, Elara said. Car accelerated into the empty city. Dante looked at the case in Elara's hands. He looked at the window, at the streets moving past familiar streets, the streets of the city he'd operated in for 15 years. The city that had been the geography of everything he'd built, and everything he'd lost, and everything he was only now understanding about what he had actually been building all along. Kane knows Victor gave him up, Dante said. Probably. He'll have someone watching the restaurant. Elara's eyes were on the road ahead, which means he knows we're coming. Then why are we going? She looked at him. Because knowing you're coming and being able to stop you are two different things. She paused. And because he doesn't know what I'm going to do when I get there. What are you going to do? She opened the case, removed the ledger, and underneath it, a secondary device that Dante hadn't seen before. A compact transmitter, the kind of equipment that required specific knowledge to operate and specific infrastructure to receive. I'm not going to bring the ledger to Kane, she said. I'm going to broadcast it. Dante looked at the transmitter. To who? Every faction leader in Chicago. Every senior operator in the network, every organization that Kane has used as a vehicle for his operation over the last 20 years. She looked at the device in her hands. Financial records, transaction histories, names. Specifically, the names of people Kane has been running operations through without their knowledge, people who believed they were making their own decisions and were actually making Kane's. That's everyone, Dante said. That's half the criminal infrastructure of this city. Yes, they're going to respond the way people respond when they find out they've been managed without their knowledge. Her voice was steady and certain. Kane spent 40 years building insulation. One broadcast destroys all of it simultaneously. Every organization he's embedded himself in becomes a liability. Every contact he's cultivated becomes someone who has a personal reason to ensure he never surfaces again. Dante thought about it. The architecture of it, the elegance and the violence of it, not physical violence, but the specific violence of total exposure, of a man's carefully constructed invisibility being stripped away in every direction simultaneously. He'll run, Dante said. He'll try. He said he's prepared to disappear. He's prepared to disappear from legal scrutiny, from investigators, from law enforcement, from the standard mechanisms that people use to find people who don't want to be found. She held his gaze. He is not prepared for every organization he's manipulated to be looking for him, simultaneously with full knowledge of his actual identity and methods. The car was moving fast through the city, past the boundary of Chicago proper, and into the northern suburbs. The density of the built environment thinning, streets wider and quieter, the darkness between streetlights longer. Dante's phone buzzed. Tay. He answered it so fast he barely registered the motion. Tay, I'm out. Tay's voice was rough-strained, the voice of someone who had been through something and was running on the other side of it. I'm out. I'm okay, they let me go. Dante went very still. They let you go. 20 minutes ago. Just drove me to an intersection and told me to get out of the car. A pause, the sound of breathing. Dante, they knew everything. They knew about the West Side property. They knew about Elara. They knew about the ledger. His voice dropped. They told me to tell you. Kane says there's still time to make a different decision. Car was quiet. Dante looked at Elara. She had heard it. Her face was composed, but her right hand, holding the transmitter, had tightened. He could see it in the whitening across her knuckles. Tell me the intersection, Dante said to Tay. He listened, wrote it on his hand, ended the call. He looked at Margot. Tay is clean, pick him up. He gave her the intersection. Margot handed the information to Priz on a secondary line without breaking speed. Dante turned to Elara. He released Tay as a message. Yes. He still thinks there's a negotiation available. He released Tay because he wanted you to call him back. She looked at the transmitter. He's trying to slow us down. Every minute we spend considering the offer is a minute he uses to get out of that property. How far? Margot, 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Dante thought about Kane releasing Tay as a gesture, the calculated warmth of it, the same professional warmth he'd heard on the phone. A man who understood that human sentiment was a tool and deployed it with the same precision he deployed everything else. He thought about Bracco dead on a warehouse floor. He thought about Victor Rusk's face when he said, I knew. He looked at Elara. When we get there, what do you need? Time. 10 minutes on the transmitter to push the broadcast to all channels simultaneously. Once it starts, it can't be stopped or recalled. She paused. I need 10 minutes without Kane's people shutting down the signal. I'll give you 10 minutes. She looked at him for a moment. Dante, Kane is going to have people at that property. I know, you have Carmine. Carmine is compromised. You have Reyes. And yourself. A pause. That's not enough to hold a perimeter. Then, I won't hold a perimeter, he said. I'll make enough noise to make one unnecessary. She looked at him that flat, measuring look that he had spent 6 years misreading as distance and was only now understanding as the specific attention of someone who is deciding how much to trust you with. 10 minutes, she said. 10 minutes. Margot took a turn hard and fast, the tires gripping the wet asphalt of a tree-lined street in the northern suburbs. Houses dark on both sides, and ahead at the end of a long private drive, behind a stone wall, the lights of a property that looked from the outside like the home of a successful and entirely conventional wealthy man. Dante checked what he was carrying. He thought about what he was walking into, thought about the version of himself that Kane had built over 15 years, the vehicle, the asset, the man who believed he was making his own decisions and was actually serving a function in someone else's architecture. He thought about what it meant to be something else. Car stopped 20 meters from the property entrance. Dante looked at Elara one more time. She had the transmitter ready. She had the ledger open to the broadcast index. Her hands were steady, with the steadiness of someone who has been moving toward this specific moment for 2 years, and has finally arrived at it and is not going to stop now, regardless of what the next 10 minutes cost. He opened the car door. The night air was cold and wet and smelled of the lake, the particular smell of Chicago in autumn, raw and wide, and carrying no sentiment about any of the things that happened in it. He walked toward the property entrance. Somewhere ahead of him, Marcellus Kane was making preparations to disappear from a world. He had spent 40 years reshaping to his own specifications and had not yet understood that The woman who had been quietly dismantling as those specifications for 2 years was 30 seconds away from making every single one of them public, permanent, and impossible to escape. Stone wall was directly in front of him now. The gate was closed, and from inside the property came the sound of movement, multiple sets of feet, the particular quality of organized motion that meant Kane's people had been watching the road and had seen the car stop and were already repositioning. Dante pressed one hand flat against the cold stone of the wall. He breathed once, slow and deliberate, the way he'd taught himself to breathe, in moments that required everything he had and offered no guarantees about what came after. Then he went over the wall. He cleared the wall and landed hard on the other side, gravel and wet grass under his palms, the impact traveling up through his wrists and into his shoulders with the blunt honesty of physics, making no concessions for urgency. He was up in under 2 seconds. The property was larger than it looked from the street. A main house set back from the entrance, what appeared to be a secondary structure to the left that might have been a garage or a guest house. Mature trees along the interior of the wall, providing cover that ran maybe 30 meters toward the main building. The lights he'd seen from the road were concentrated in the front rooms of the house. The secondary structure was dark. He counted 3 men repositioning, 2 moving toward the gate from the right side of the house, 1 coming around the left from behind the secondary structure. Professional spacing, no shouting, no lights, the organized silence of people who had been told to contain a situation rather than escalate it publicly in a residential neighborhood in Evanston at 1 in the morning. Kane's people. And Kane had told them to contain, not eliminate, which meant Kane still believed there was a negotiation available, which meant Dante still had. Something Kane wanted badly enough to keep him alive for another few minutes. He used those minutes. He went left, toward the secondary structure, staying low and close to the tree line, moving with the particular economy of a man who is not young anymore and knows it and has stopped pretending that recklessness is the same as effectiveness. The man coming around from behind the secondary structure was moving too fast. The overconfidence of someone who expects to be the one doing the surprising, and Dante let him commit to his line before he stepped into it. Collision was brief and not clean. Nothing physical was ever clean. There was the impact, and the leverage, and the man going down onto the wet grass, and Dante's hand on the back of his neck, applying pressure with enough precision to produce unconsciousness without permanent damage, because Dante had made a decision in a car 30 minutes ago about what kind of man he was going to be when this was over, and he intended to maintain that decision under conditions that made it difficult. He took the man's radio. He pressed himself against the exterior wall of the secondary structure and listened. The radio gave him the positions of the other 2. They were at the gate, working from the assumption that he would try to open it from the inside to bring the car through. They hadn't realized yet that he'd come in alone. He had approximately 4 minutes before they figured that out and reorganized. He looked at the main house, the lights in the front rooms. A shadow, moving behind a ground floor window, someone, pacing, which meant someone who was waiting and was not comfortable waiting. Kane. He moved toward the house. The front door was unlocked, which surprised him until it didn't. Kane was a man who understood that locked doors were a signal, who understood that communicated fear, and fear communicated vulnerability, and a man in Kane's position never communicated vulnerability if he could avoid it. An unlocked door in a contained property said something different. It said, "I am not afraid of what's coming through this door." Dante pushed it open and went in. The entry was large and clean, the interior of a man who moved through spaces without accumulating them. Furniture that was adequate and impersonal. Nothing on the walls that would tell you anything specific about the person who lived here. The pacing shadow had been in the room to the left. Dante moved toward it. Marcellus Kane was standing at the window when Dante came through the door. He was older than Dante had expected, from a man whose presence in the city felt current and immediate, late 60s. Maybe early 70s, the kind of age that settled on certain men as authority rather than deterioration. Silver-haired, well-built, dressed with the understated precision of someone for whom appearance was a tool that required maintenance. He had his hands clasped behind his back and was looking out the window at his own property with the expression of a man watching something he has arranged unfold according to plan. He turned when Dante entered. He did not look surprised. He had known Dante was coming through the house, had probably known the moment Dante went over the wall, and had chosen to remain at the window rather than meet him at the door, which was its own statement about how Kane understood the dynamics of a room. "You came alone," Kane said. "Yes." "That's either very confident or very stupid." His voice was the same as it had been on the phone, warm, measured, the particular warmth of a man who has cultivated it so long it's become indistinguishable from genuine. "Where's your wife?" "She's not my wife," Dante said. "She hasn't been for about 23 hours. Something moved across Kane's expression and acknowledgement, perhaps, that this was a more complicated answer than the question had been designed to receive. "And the ledger?" "Not here." "I know it's not here." Kane moved away from the window, not toward Dante, but to the side, toward a low table with a decanter on it, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who is managing the pace of a scene and knows it. "Would you like a drink?" "No, I would." Kane poured 2 fingers of something into a glass and held it without drinking. "Down, Dante." "I'll stand." Kane looked at him. He assessed the damage, the scrapes on Dante's hands, from the wall, the grass stain on his knee, the general condition of a man who has been awake for 22 hours and has spent the last 3 of them moving through a city in crisis. He seemed to arrive at a conclusion about what this information meant. "The woman outside your gate," Kane said. "The one with the transmitter. She has approximately," he glanced at his watch, 8 minutes before my technical team jams the broadcast frequency. Dante went cold. Not the theatrical cold of a dramatic pause, but the actual specific cold of a man receiving information that rearranges the structure of the next 10 minutes completely. "You know about the transmitter," Dante said. "I've known about your wife's operation for 14 months. Kane set the glass down. "Not every detail. She's talented, and she was careful. But the broad architecture, yes. The ledger, the broadcast plan, the network of women she assembled." He paused. "I know about Margot. I know about the financial analyst. I know about the woman you call Pris, whose actual name you never learned, which I'll tell you means she trusted you even less than she trusted the arrangement." He looked at Dante steadily. "I've been aware of most of it. Then why did you let it run?" "Because it was useful." Kane picked up the glass again, and this time drank a small, deliberate sip. "Your wife is an exceptional intelligence operative. She documented things about my operation that I had never put in writing myself. Her ledger is more complete, in certain respects, than my own records." A pause. I wanted to see how far she could get. Dante looked at him. He thought about everything Elara had built, the years of it, the patience of it, the cost of it, and what it meant to hear that the man she'd been building it against had been watching her build it. "You were going to take it from her," Dante said. "I was going to acquire it at the right moment." "Yes." Kane set the glass down again. "The right moment turned out to be last night, when Victor moved against you. The intention was that you would come apart organizationally, personally, that in the chaos, Elara would be forced to move the ledger, and when she moved it, we'd take it." He paused. "You were supposed to be looking inward, not outward." "I looked outward." "Yes. That was unexpected." Kane's voice carried something that in another context might have been genuine appreciation. "You trusted her faster than I calculated you would." "You calculated wrong." "I did." A pause. "Which brings us here." Dante looked at him. He thought about the technical team and the broadcast frequency and the 8 minutes that was now probably 7, and he made a decision with the speed of a man who has learned over the last 24 hours to make decisions based on what he actually values rather than what he believes he should value. "You're not going to jam it," Dante said. Kane looked at him. "Because you don't have a technical team here," Dante said. "If you had the capability to jam the broadcast, you would have jammed it before I came over the wall. You would have jammed it the moment you knew we were coming." He held Kane's eyes. "You told me 8 minutes because you needed me standing in this room talking to you, instead of back at that car, making sure Elara has what she needs to complete the broadcast." He paused.
"You've been stalling."
Kane was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his expression. Something small and specific. A shift at the corners of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else. the expression of a man who has just been read accurately by someone he underestimated. "You're smarter than I built you to be," Kane said. "You didn't build me," Dante said. "That's what you got wrong." He turned toward the door. "Dante." Kane's voice was different now, not warm, not measured, stripped of the professional texture that had covered it for the last 10 minutes. What was underneath was older and quieter, and more dangerous. That broadcast goes out, there is no version of the next year in which you are safe. Every organization I've embedded will be looking for the source. They will find your name attached to the ledger. They will. My name is already attached to everything in that ledger, Dante said without turning. You made sure of that. He paused at the door. The difference is that after tonight, they'll also have your name. And unlike me, you don't have anyone who spent 6 years quietly keeping you alive. He walked out of the room. He came back over the wall faster than he'd gone over it, dropping onto the street with enough force to jar his knees and not caring, moving toward the car where Margot was standing outside the driver's door with her eyes on her watch. "She needs 2 more minutes," Margot said when she saw him. The frequency handshake took longer than projected. "Kane doesn't have a jamming team," Dante said. It was a bluff. Margot looked at him for a beat. Then she turned and spoke into her comm. Dante went to the passenger side. Elara was in the back seat, both hands on the transmitter, her eyes on the device's interface with the focused stillness of someone threading a needle in a moving vehicle. The ledger was open on the seat beside her, specific pages marked with the broadcast index financial records, transaction chains, names, the full documented history of 40 years of Marcellus Kane's invisible architecture rendered suddenly and permanently visible. Kane knew about the operation, Dante said. 14 months. Elara didn't look up. "I know," he stopped. "You know. I've known for 6 months that he knew. That's why I accelerated the timeline." Her fingers moved across the transmitter interface with precise, small adjustments. If he'd been able to acquire the ledger quietly, it would have disappeared, and there would be no evidence it ever existed. The only way to make it irremovable was to broadcast it to enough recipients simultaneously that suppression became impossible. A pause. "I needed him to believe he had more time than he did. You were running a counterbluff. I was doing what the situation required." She looked up briefly, just long enough to meet his eyes, and then back down at the device. 40 seconds. Dante got in the car and closed the door. He sat in the quiet of the vehicle and listened to the city around them, the specific silence of a residential street in Evanston. At 1:30 in the morning, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. The lake somewhere beyond that, present as always, indifferent as always. He looked at his hands in his lap. The scrapes from the wall were not deep. They would be gone in a week. He thought about Marcellus Kane standing at a window in a house that didn't belong to him, in a city he had treated as a resource for 40 years, watching the moment his insulation ran out. He thought about the word built. "You didn't build me." He had said it, and he had meant it. He was working out in the quiet of the car, whether it was entirely true. Kane had provided infrastructure. Kane had shaped conditions. Kane had arranged the furniture of the world. Dante moved through and let Dante believe he was choosing where to sit. The choices, the actual choices, the ones that made Dante the person he was at this specific moment. In this specific car, having just walked into a room alone and walked back out, those were his. Bad ones and the good ones, and the ones he didn't have clean words for. A man was not the infrastructure he moved through. He was still working out whether he fully believed that when the transmitter made a sound small, definitive, the mechanical acknowledgement of a completed transmission. And, Elara said quietly, "It's done." The hours after were not dramatic. Drama, Dante had learned over 15 years, was the surface of things, the visible portion of decisions that had been made hours or days or years earlier, in rooms that no one would ever describe as dramatic. The actual work of consequence was slower and less photogenic, and asked more of a person than the moment of action ever did. Victor Rusk made contact with federal investigators at 4:17 in the morning, through an attorney he'd had on retainer for years, against precisely this kind of contingency. He provided 14 hours of testimony over the following 2 days. The documentation he offered, combined with the ledger contents that were now a sum into possession of every significant criminal organization in the city, several investigative journalists, 2 federal agencies, and a network of financial regulators that Elara had added to the broadcast list without advertising. That fact was more than sufficient. Marcellus Kane was located at O'Hare International Airport at 6:45 the following morning, attempting to board a connecting flight to Zurich under a name that was not his. The identification documents were excellent. They would have passed standard screening without difficulty. They did not pass the particular scrutiny of a retired intelligence officer named Priss, whose real name Dante learned only later, and whose involvement in the airport that morning was the result of a call Elara had made the night before last. Priss had 3 contacts remaining from her previous career. She had used all 3 of them that night. She had not asked Elara's permission, because Elara had not asked her to. She had trusted Priss to make the calls that needed to be made, which was the same trust Elara had extended to everyone in the basement in Pilsen, the same trust that had allowed a network of 4 people to dismantle 40 years of invisible architecture over the course of a single night. Kane was taken into custody at the gate. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He walked with the same measured composure he had brought to every room he'd ever entered. And if there was anything visible on his face in the security footage that Dante watched later, it was not fear and not defeat, but something more interior than either, the expression of a man doing the private accounting of a long life and arriving at a number that had finally come due. Dante watched the footage twice. Then he closed the file and didn't open it again. Tay had 2 cracked ribs and a laceration above his left ear that required 6 stitches. He made no complaint about either. He sat in the emergency room at 3 in the morning, with his phone in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance, processing. Whatever he was processing in the private way that certain people process things internally, without exhibition, arriving at their conclusions alone and presenting only the conclusions. When Dante came to see him, Tay looked up and said, "The other one cracked when I hit the car door. First one was already gone before that. I know. Just wanted it on record." A pause. "We good?" "We're good," Dante said. He stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying, which was its own measure of the kind of relationship that had actually existed between them across the years, the practical, undemonstrative loyalty of men who had worked in proximity to danger and understood that what mattered was not the articulation of the thing, but the doing of it. Carmine did not come to the hospital. Carmine had disappeared from the dockside sometime during the hour that Dante was at the Evanston property, which Dante had half expected. Reyes had kept Victor in the restaurant as instructed, but Carmine had simply walked out into the city and been absorbed by it, and Dante did not look for him. There would be time for that accounting. There were people better positioned to conduct it than him. He was beginning to understand, no longer the right person to conduct most of the accountings that the last 15 years had generated. The Bellavita estate sat empty for 11 days. On the 12th day, Dante went back to it alone, early in the morning when the light was gray and horizontal, and the city felt permeable in the specific way it felt before full day committed to itself. He walked through the rooms without turning on the lights the entry hall, where he had thrown a suitcase on the marble floor in front of 12 witnesses, the study where he had spent a sleepless night reading 41 pages, wing security room where he had begun to understand the shape of what Elara had built inside the walls of his own life. He didn't stay long. He made 2 calls from the study, one to a lawyer who had been waiting for the instruction, one to a man who ran the legitimate side of 3 businesses that Dante had acquired over the years, and who had been managing them with the quiet competence of someone who understood that the legitimate side was the side worth keeping. He gave both calls the information they needed. He answered the questions they had. He made the decisions that were still his to make and declined the ones that weren't. He left the estate at 9 in the morning and did not take anything from it except a photograph that is sitting on his desk since before he could remember being the person he had been. Photographs of a street in a city he'd grown up in, taken from a specific angle that made the street look wider and more generous than it actually was, and which he had kept not for sentiment but for the reminder that perspective was constructed, that the frame determined what the image meant. He thought, carrying it to the car, that it was time to reframe some things. He found Elara 3 weeks later. Not because he tracked her, he didn't. He found her because she allowed it, which he understood by this point was the only way finding Elara Vale had ever worked. She was in the Pilsen house, not the basement, but the upper floors, which turned out to be a livable space that she had been using intermittently for 2 years. She answered the door when he knocked, which meant she had seen him on approach and made a decision. And the fact that the door opened was the entirety of what she chose to communicate about that decision. She looked rested in the way that people look after. They have carried something very heavy for a very long time and have finally been able to put it down, not fully recovered. Because that kind of resting took longer than 3 weeks, but present in herself, in a way, she hadn't been in the basement, with the equipment and the transmitter and the weight of 2 years of a plan reaching its conclusion. "Come in," she said. He came in. The upper floor was spare and ordered the home of someone who had learned to live without accumulation, who kept only what was necessary and had developed a fine eye for what was and wasn't necessary. There were books, a work table, good light from windows that faced west, coffee maker that was running, evidence of a life being lived rather than a position being maintained. He sat at the table because she gestured to it. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him, the way she had sat across from him at other tables in other rooms, across 6 years with the straight-backed, present quality of someone who did not fidget, who did not fill silence with noise, who allowed a moment to be what it was without intervention. "Kane entered a plea agreement," she said. "I heard federal charges will take years to fully process. The civil exposure from the organizations he defrauded runs parallel." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He's not going anywhere." No. Victor's cooperation put a ceiling on his own sentencing. His testimony was sufficient to establish Kane's direct involvement in Bracco's death, which was what the investigators needed most. A pause. "Victor will serve time. Not as much as he should, probably. Some." Dante nodded. He had known this was how it would go. The machinery of consequence was not precise, it was approximate. And its approximations were shaped by what could be proven and what could be exchanged and what the people operating it found useful. He had spent 15 years understanding how that machinery worked. He was still inside its understanding, but outside its operation now, which was a different relationship to have with it. "My family," he said. She looked at him. The order that came through the organization. 7 years ago, he held her eyes. "You said someone inside ordered it. And then you said Kane had been framing me for crimes I didn't authorize." He paused. "Was he the one who ordered your family killed?" She was quiet for a moment. Her hands around the cup were still. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "My father was an accountant." Her voice was level, but something that has been examined so many times it has lost the ability to surprise. "He worked for a firm that did auxiliary bookkeeping for 3 organizations in this city, and he stumbled into a set of records that connected financial flows across all 3 in a way that pointed directly to a single coordinating entity." A pause. He didn't know what he was looking at. He brought it to his supervisor. His supervisor was one of Kane's people. Dante looked at her. Thought about a man doing ordinary work numbers, ledgers, the ordinary arithmetic of professional life, and finding a thing that got him killed because of what it implied rather than what he understood. He never knew, Dante said. He had 3 days between finding the records and the night they came to the house, she said. I don't know what he knew in those 3 days. I wasn't there, I was in another city. A pause. I was always somewhere else when the things that mattered most were happening. The sentence carried weight that she didn't perform it, was simply in it, the weight of a person who has lived with a particular regret for long enough. That it has become structural, part of the way they understand themselves, rather than a wound that still surprised them. You came back, Dante said. I came back and I found what was left, and I spent a year figuring out where it pointed. She looked at her cup. And then I made a decision that I have spent 6 years deciding whether I'm at peace with. Are you? She considered it honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. I'm at peace with most of it. A pause. Not all of it. He understood what not all of it meant. He didn't ask her to itemize it, because some accountings were private, and she had already given him far more access to her interior life than she gave most people, and he understood, finally, what that cost a person of her particular temperament. I'm sorry, he said, for throwing you out. She looked at him. I know it was. I know it served the plan. I know it was part of how you needed it to go. He held her gaze. it was still wrong. The way I did it, in front of those men with the suitcase on the floor. He paused. That was me deciding. Your silence was a verdict on you, instead of a choice you were making. And I was wrong about that for 6 years. She looked at him for a long moment. I know you were, she said. No softening on it, but no hardness either. Just the flat accuracy of a woman who had stopped pretending that the truth required decoration. The ring is in my desk drawer, he said, at the estate. I didn't know what to do with it. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to take it back, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. He stopped, looked at his hands on the table, looked back at her. I wanted you to know that I know what I had, what I didn't understand I had. He paused. 6 years of someone standing inside your life, holding it together, and I thought your silence was weakness. It was watching, she said. I know that now. The room was quiet. Outside, the city went about its morning with the complete indifference it brought to all things, the grief and the relief, and the long, uncomfortable work of people deciding who they were going to be when the part of their life that had defined them for years was finally over. Elara looked out the west window. The light was fuller now, the gray of early morning giving way to something more committed. I'm going to close the Pilsen operation, she said. Margot has been offered a position legitimate intelligence consulting. The kind of work she was doing before everything went wrong for her. She's going to take it. A pause. Danny is finishing a degree she started 5 years ago and stopped. Priz will be fine. She always is. And you, Dante said. She looked at the table for a moment, at her hands, and then out the window again. I have my father's records, she said. The original documents, the ones he found that started everything. I want to make sure they go somewhere that can use them properly. There are cases still open, organizations Kane was connected to, that haven't been fully untangled. A pause. That work will take time, but it's the right work. It sounds like the work you're built for, Dante said. She looked at him. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the physical precursor of one, the face deciding whether to commit. It might be, she said. He stood up. He picked up his cup and carried it to the counter, because it was the ordinary thing to do. The small domestic gesture of a person occupying a space with some consideration for the person who lived in it. He set it in the sink. He turned around. She was still at the table, both hands around her cup, watching him with the full, direct attention that had taken him 6 years to understand was not assessment, but presence, the quality of a person who, when they looked at you, was actually looking at you rather than at the version of you they needed you to be. The estate is being restructured, he said. The legitimate businesses are going to people who can run them cleanly. The rest is being handed over in ways that I should have handled years ago. He paused. I'm not sure. What comes after that? What do you want to come after that? It was the second time she had asked him what he wanted. He was beginning to understand that this was, for Elara Valle, a form of respect, the refusal to assume, the insistence on asking rather than managing. He thought about it honestly. Something I built myself, he said, whatever that ends up meaning. She nodded once. Slow and considered, the nod of someone who finds the answer sufficient. He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame and paused there for a moment, not because there was anything left to say, but because the moment had the particular quality of certain moments where leaving it too quickly felt like a failure of attention, like not staying with the last note of something long enough to let it finish. He thought about the photograph in his car, the street made wider and more generous by the angle of the shot, perspective constructed, frame determining meaning. He thought about a woman who had spent 6 years inside his life choosing, every single day, to hold a thing together that she could have walked away from, not for him. Not entirely, but not entirely, not for him either. In the way that human motivations rarely sorted cleanly into the categories people preferred. He thought about what it meant to have been protected by someone without knowing it. Strange, uncomfortable gratitude of it. The impossibility of repayment, and the fact that repayment was not what had ever been asked for. He took his hand off the frame. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said. He walked down the stairs and out into the morning. Pilsen Street received him without comment, a man in his 40s, unremarkable at a distance, walking to a car parked at the curb with the unhurried step of someone who has somewhere to go and is not running from where he's been. He got in. He sat for a moment with the photograph on the passenger seat beside him. Then he started the car and pulled out into the street and drove. 3 blocks away, Elara stood at the west window of the upper floor and watched the city settle into its full morning. The light was coming in good and flat now, the kind of light that showed things as they actually were, no softening, no flattery, just the objects and the spaces between them and the ordinary facts of a day beginning. She picked up her father's records from the work table. She sat down. She opened the first page. She had work to do. And for the first time in 7 years, the work she was doing belonged entirely to her, not to a plan, not to a target, not to the long, patient architecture of justice being assembled in secret inside someone else's life. Just to her, and to the truth her father had stumbled into without understanding what he found, and the work of making sure that what he found finally meant something permanent and real. She read the first page. Then she turned to the second. Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, cold and specific and entirely indifferent to the private conclusions of the people who moved through it, asking nothing of them except that they keep moving, keep deciding, keep choosing what kind of person to be in the full and undecorated daylight of whatever came next. The ledger that had started everything was ash in a metal waste bin in the West Side property. Elara had burned it the morning after the broadcast, because the people who had used it to control others were gone, and a weapon that no longer had an enemy was just a danger looking for a target. The truth it had contained was already everywhere, and that was, at the end of it, the only victory that had ever been worth having.